So, welcome to Seattle.
Thank you.
Where do you live?
I live north of Toronto, a little town called Arroyo, about 30,000 people on Lake Eccc. Lake of Many Winds. It's about 3 miles by 11 miles. And it's a lovely lake, and we're right on it, and it's very enjoyable. But just half the year we spend there in the summer, and my lady has a place down in Orange Beach, Alabama, right on the Gulf. So it's half a year here and half a year there.
Did you grow up near Toronto?
I grew up in a town called Guelph, which was southwest of Toronto, about 70 miles, I guess. And I was there until I was about 19, and then I struck out on my own. I took the famous artist course. And it was quite good for me. But when I got to the chapter that was called Earn While You Learn, I went on my own. I never finished the course. Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about getting started. And you started off as a cartoonist.
Yeah. No, I didn't. I started off as an illustrator, really.
Okay.
And when I went out on my own, I did. First, when I got out of high school, I did murals, portraits, anything that would turn $1. And after a while, I went to Montreal and worked for Rapid Grip and Batten, which was, at the time was a studio that employed, I think, more artists than anywhere else in North America. Layout people and designers and so on, and illustrators. And I was there for a couple of years as a junior artist, an illustrator.
And what kind of stuff was it you were doing there?
Well, mostly I was just a go-boy, you know, because I was just learning the ropes. I'd get the odd commercial job. And then I went to, I left there after about 2 years, and I went to Toronto and got a job in a small studio called Mercer Studios. I was making $19 a week in Montreal, and living as a boarder in a fraternity. It was a good time. And then when I went to Toronto, I was making $50 a week, quite a jump. So I was there for about 1.5 years. And I got a job doing a book for W.J. Gage. It was a reader in color. And there were about 50 illustrations at $50 a piece.
Oh, wow.
And I was really flying then. And I got married at that time.
And I'm sorry, what year is this about? Like what year, roughly?
That would have been about 1955,
wow.
55.
So $50 an illustration back then, it's pretty good.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
Yes, some people were making $57 a week in those days, you know.
Wow.
So I had a relative, that's what he was making. So no, and it was a nice little studio, and I learned an awful lot. I learned there the art of wash drawing. And it's quite a challenge. We were doing ads on the back of newspapers, big page, full page. They'd have toasters and so on, and blankets and, you know, Chesterfields or couches, as you people say. And so that studio did that kind of work. And it was all wash drawing, black and white. And it was good training. And my boss, Mr. Mercer, would come along and look at my work, and he'd say, that looks fine, but let's have Gil sweeten it. And he'd give it to the senior illustrator, and just with a few strokes, he just made that thing sing, you see?
Wow.
I mean, a toaster. And so then, as I say, I learned an awful lot about wash drawing, which is what I do with Playboy.
Right, so tell me a little bit about that, the process of wash drawing, what you learned there.
Well, wash drawing, I suppose in a nutshell, you will learn very quickly that the less you do, the better. The minute you start working it up like you can with oils or opaques, you ruin the freshness, you see. And that's number one, I think. And preliminary work is terribly important. To me, when I get to the finish of a Playboy cartoon, most of the work's done, you know, when I'm doing the final art.
Mm-hmm.
And but when I started out, I started doing work for textbook manufacturers, you see, and I think I worked for just about every one of them in North America, especially in the Toronto region. And I also did illustrations for magazines. It was a great time for me. I wanted to be an illustrator, but at that time the art of illustration was dying, or the need for it, the requirement. You had Collier's and a lot of magazines that were folding.
Okay. This is like Mad Men era, right?
Yes, yes. And but fortunately, there were a couple of new magazines that were weekly magazines that were distributed to the papers, you see. The Toronto Star Weekly, for instance, a product of the Toronto Star in those days. And the Toronto Star was the largest newspaper in Canada. And so they were constantly requiring illustrations for stories. And then there's Weekend Magazine that was owned by another paper, you see, and kind of a conglomerate. And I worked doing that. I had great assignments with them. They would ask me for a story and illustrate it. And then they'd send along a writer to caption it. And it'd be a day at the beach, and they'd give me 3 or 4 pages. You know, a big illustration, and a bunch of little ones in the following pages. And I'd come up with the ideas, and I wasn't the only artist doing this. But it was a godsend for my kind of work. Very loose, washes, color. And I did a toga party, for instance, Life in the Day of a Mennonite. And it was just great. And they don't have that today.
Right, right.
And it was a real opportunity for me.
And it was sequential art storytelling you were doing.
Yeah.
It was sequential art, like a comic book.
Yeah. Only you had a rotogravure, a big format, you see, to work on.
Right.
And the reproductions were beautiful. And it was about that time, I was doing some work for Weekend Magazine, that I was asked by W.J. Gage, one of the big publishers. They even kept me on retainer at that time. And when you're freelance, that's kind of nice.
Yeah.
And so W.J. Gage asked me if I would finish 2 high school textbooks that they had been working on with an illustrator who'd just recently died in a car accident. And would I finish it? And they gave me all the originals, which if I'd kept it would be worth a fortune today, because this guy did great fine art. His stuff was in the Ontario Art Gallery. And his name was Oscar Kaheen. And I saw this stuff and I wept. It was so beautiful.
Wow.
And so I had to try and adapt to this, and it was almost impossible. But it kicked me into a new gear. And it's then I started doing very loose drawings and color stuff for Weekend and the other magazines. And at that time, I was down in Montreal talking to the art gallery, the art director of Weekend Magazine, and he said to me, you know, you're using inks, but Oscar didn't use inks. He used aniline dyes by Dr. P.H. Martin. And they come in little jars, and they're about 50 to a box. I just bought my second box after about 50 years using the first box.
Wow.
Because they last forever, except yellow ochre and some of the ones that you really use a lot of. And so he said, and he also said that he works on this special board, Arches of France, you see. And that combination just made my work sing, I thought.
Interesting.
And it was around that time that I was in Chicago. I presume you're going to ask me how I got started.
Yeah, we're getting there.
And I don't remember why I went there, but it wasn't to see Playboy. But at the last minute, I thought I'll take along some stuff
Okay.
and see if they'd like to use, because they had fiction stories and maybe they'd like an
So
illustrator.
how far along was Playboy at this point?
This was, Playboy started in '53.
Mm-hmm.
I went down there in '63.
Oh, okay.
So they were well along.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember they were in their first quarters in Chicago. And on the second floor, I remember getting off the elevator, and they just had 2 elevators, and then a partition in the middle, and then on the partition was a cartoon by Cole. And he was a god in those days. Unfortunately, he had a short life, but I think he was my favorite of all of them. And very loose washes. And he had this cartoon he'd done. It's famous now. And it's this gal talking into a microphone, and she's singing, you know, and she's built like you can't believe. And she's singing, and the caption is, "I ain't got no body." And it was worth the trip just to see that. I just stood there and looked at it and drooled over it. And then I met with the art director, and I said, "I thought you might like to use me for illustrations." He looked at my stuff. He says, "No, you're a cartoonist." I said, "No, I'm not. I've been training as an illustrator." And he said, I said, "I don't think I could think up the gags." And he said, we have writers." And I said, I'll never forget, I said, "I still don't think it's my cup of tea." And then he told me what they paid. I said, "This is my cup of tea." So that was the start of it. Mm-hmm. And it was kind of nice because I was still doing freelance work.
So were you still doing textbooks at the same time as
I was
Playboy?
still doing textbooks.
Wow.
I was still illustrating magazines. If somebody wanted a portrait, if there was $1 in it, I'd do that
Mm-hmm.
too, you know. And it was ideal because when you're freelance, it's a risk.
Mm-hmm.
You never know where your next job's coming from.
Right.
I talked to a guy here one day, it was another show,
Mm-hmm.
and he does these comic pages. He says when he's done a contract, he's tearing his hair out because he doesn't know where the next job's coming
Sure,
from,
yeah.
or if it's coming.
Mm-hmm.
But I always had Playboy to fall back on. I always had 8 or 10 cartoons that had been approved by Hef.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I was slack and stuff, as long as I kept giving them what they required
Mm-hmm.
for a year, and they treated me very well. They paid me a bonus and every year and a signing fee because I was on contract, and I still am.
So you're still to this day doing work for Playboy?
Yeah, I got to eat. No, it's fun. It's fun work. You know,
sure.
it's not work.
Yeah.
When you're doing something you love, somebody said to me today, he says, you're not working.
And so over the course of these decades working, I mean, you're largely known for your work in Playboy.
Yeah.
And the magazine has changed a lot over the years.
Yes.
How does that affect your approach to doing the work?
Well, the magazine is probably only featuring half as many cartoons as they used to because it's a smaller magazine in thickness. What's hit so many magazines is hit Playboy too, but in spite of that, it's still surviving, which is quite commendable.
Sure.
And but outside of that, I suppose my work has evolved over the years. I'm a lot tighter, and I wish I weren't. But in those days, I had so much work to do. I just knocked these things off like you wouldn't believe. Although it's a tedious, more tedious than some cartoonists, you know, who do very simplistic cartoons that go into don't get into the detail. Mine do. Yeah, I was at the mansion.
All right.
We were doing a show.
So you've been to the mansion. How many times have you been to the mansion?
Yeah, we were going to ask that.
Well, you brought it
No,
up.
I just was doing it. I also did. I should mention this because it was a big part of my life. I was called by the managing editor one day of Canada's largest newspaper, the Toronto Star. And he said, I want you to do a cartoon a day for me 5 days a week.
Wow.
And I wanted it on their world news page. And so I went to see him, and he said he'd pay me, I don't know, $200 a week, which is a lot in those days, and to do 5 cartoons a week. And they wanted them news-oriented if possible, you know. A typical one would be the Nixons, or no, just a couple reading the morning paper over breakfast. And the wife says to the husband, you know, just because Nixon says it's so doesn't necessarily mean that it isn't so. It was that sort of thing they wanted.
Right.
And the downside of it was that I had to take in about a dozen cartoons every week to get 5 selected.
Wow.
And often the ones they selected were the throwaway ones. And that was a frustrating part of it. But then I got into the Toronto Star, started syndicating me, and so I got into a lot of papers in the United States, the Boston Globe and so on. And then I started some other features too myself. One called Scoops, which was a series, like a comic strip. And I sold that myself. I traveled to 90 cities in 60 days.
Oh, wow.
The thing with the Toronto Star fizzled out after a while, after about 10 or 12 years.
So you were self-syndicating by going from
So
city to city?
I started, I had been syndicated by the Toronto Star Syndicate and a smaller syndicate, Media Features, and they were bought out by the Chicago Tribune, New York News, and so on. And then I came up with this idea for Scoops. And I traveled to 90 cities in 60 days and sold 73% of the papers I traveled to. And that was quite an experience.
How do you do 90 cities in 60 days? How do you do 90 cities in 60 days?
It's crazy. You get into a hotel around, 8 o'clock at night, and you're phoning, trying to set something up the next day.
Yeah, sure.
I'll never forget, I had to go to Pensacola or someplace, but way north of it. So I phoned and I got through to the airport, or somebody at the airport. And I said, do I have to go through Atlanta? She said, you got to go through Atlanta. She said, honey, when you go to heaven, you're going to have to go through Atlanta.
And so what year was this that you were doing the self-syndicated?
That would be around 1978, 79, 80s, in there. And
so you've been doing Playboy at the same time as continuing to do
I probably
Textbooks
slowed
and
down on
syndicated?
Playboy, but they've always had a fair bank of my stuff, in reserve. So I probably stopped it for a little while.
And do you always work with a writer? Or it seems like in some of the cases
I
you're
started
writing
writing my
yourself.
own stuff.
Right.
First they started sending me these little pieces of paper or a page of gags sent in by writers. And then I started writing my own. And then people started sending me gag ideas. And that's when I decided I should be doing the drawing and let somebody else, because it takes time to think up a good gag.
Sure.
And one of my writers is a chap in Toronto who's written over 150 full-page gag ideas. And I have about a total of 4 of them now, or 4 or 5 who write.
4 or 5 writers?
Yeah, and they're awfully good. And when Playboy calls a cartoon meeting, often my writers or my lady will email them, and they'll start sending me gag ideas. And I might get 40 or 50 from one guy, and another guy will send me 6. Then I draw up the ones that I think are really going to work, at least would work for me, and that I think that Hef would like, because they all go directly to him. There was a time when they had a New York office, And Michelle Urey was the cartoon editor. She was a real sweetheart and very smart. And somebody was asked her once, what were the qualifications for being a cartoon editor for Playboy? And she said, oh, you have to have an inordinately dirty mind. So she would go through them and cut them down to the number and the kind that she thought Hef would like.
Mm-hmm.
And so now that all takes place in California now, in Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm. So when you were saying earlier that the cartoons are approved by Hef,
yeah.
do you collaborate with him at all, or he comes in at the very end and just says which ones he wants?
No, he will. His secretary or his assistant cartoon editor
Mm-hmm.
will package them up and return all of them to me,
Mm-hmm.
including all the rejects. And there might be the odd comment that Hef will write on the cartoon.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it could be anything. Girl's too homely, I don't know, but you know. And then I just take it from there, and when I get them finished, I send them in.
Mm-hmm. And so, to that comment about you need to have an inordinately dirty mind to be the
Yeah.
editor, do you have to have a dirty mind to be the cartoonist?
I don't think so. I think the humor is pretty mild in that regard,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
So has it changed over the years, though? Because I think early on when you were there in the 60s, there was a lot of counterculture happening in Playboy, right?
Yes, I suppose so. Definitely the whole magazine has evolved,
Sure.
but the basic elements are still there,
Mm-hmm.
you know. The jokes page. Unfortunately, a lot of the cartoonists are dead now. Dedini is gone. I knew him well, and he used to do a lot of work for the New Yorker.
Mm-hmm.
He was brilliant. I stopped in at his place in California, in Carmel, with the family. We were taking a motorhome trip down through the States and Canada. And there are others. Interland is gone. John Dempsey's gone. Dempsey used to do all the nudist colony ones, you know. And my great regret is I didn't meet them, but I did meet Smilby. And he was the chap who did the English type humor, Butlers and so on, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a very fine art approach to art. And he had a place in a thatch roof farmhouse on the border with Wales, and I've been there a couple of times to see him, and he was great. And he was brilliant. He also was the jazz expert on the BBC.
Oh, wow.
And he had a wall full of tapes, you see, and every week he'd be on it. And one day we called on him, and his wife was just finishing taking dictation from him. And I said, what's he doing? She said, well, it's a letter to the Times of London. And I said, does he do this often? She said, oh, yes, all the time. I said, does he get published? Because all kinds of people send letters to the editor, they never get published. She said, oh, all the time. But he was very articulate and very smart. And Michelle arranged a show for him in New York about 12, 15 years ago. And at a big gallery down in Soho. So my late wife and I went to that, and it was quite interesting. Especially his daughter flew in on the Concorde in the morning and away that night on the Concorde. I thought that was living. Yeah.
So you were doing Playboy for a long time, and then also working in newspapers and on textbooks. Was there any?
Well, I was raising 4 kids.
Right.
And my place is on the lake where the taxes are twice what they are in the city. So, yeah. Yes, and I don't have you don't have a pension in my business. You
Right.
know.
So you have to keep working
Keep working. Yeah.
forever.
Yeah.
Even with the support of.
Well, I don't work now nearly as much as I used to. I'm
Mhm.
semi-retired. I still turn out cartoons and stuff down in Florida or Alabama. And Heidi, my lady, has, who I met about 10 years ago, 11 years ago. She's become my business manager.
Mhm.
And this life that I'm into now, going to shows, we're going to do 12 this year.
Oh, wow. And this is all around your book.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. The book is given a real impetus.
Mhm.
The Art of Doug Sneyd, if you people
By
haven't seen it.
Dark Horse Comics.
Eh?
Dark Horse is releasing The Art of Doug Sneyd, right?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. And so going to these shows has been really interesting.
Mhm.
I used to belong to the American Society of Editorial Cartoonists. And that provided me with an opportunity to meet other cartoonists
Mhm.
because it's a solitary existence. It's like a writer.
Mhm.
So I come to these things, and last night somebody took us out to dinner, and we get together with other Playboy cartoonists, and Olivia, who does the Varga type gal,
Mhm.
and that's kind of a nice bonus.
Yeah, yeah.
Plus the fact if they pay my way here, as
that's
these
great.
people have, and everything, it makes it even more enticing.
Mhm. And so is it different now to have the book that's collecting, so many years of your work, so that you can, not have to be creating new stuff so much as,
Well,
getting paid
we
for
sell a
work that
lot
you've
of
done for
originals.
years? Okay.
And Heidi works the internet very, very well. She has a blog. And every week she gets people interested in buying original art, if not the big ones. I keep, for years I threw up my preliminaries. And now she's selling them for 100, 200, whatever, a piece.
Yeah.
And so there's some nice revenue there. Then I get a lot of commissions, like most of the guys here.
Right, right.
You know.
Are you on the show floor? Do you have a table?
Yeah. Yeah.
Where is it?
That's a good question.
Okay, well, find Doug downstairs.
I told the gal who brought me here, get somebody to take me back because I will never find it. It took me, must have taken 10 minutes just to walk here.
W01? Okay, and you're taking commissions
Yeah,
during the show?
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, a lot of people come thinking they can buy The Art of Doug Sneyd at my table.
Uh-huh.
If we're driving to a show, we'll take a bunch of books. But generally we say, go and see Dark Horse or whoever.
Right, right.
They're booksellers here.
Mhm.
And then they'll come back and they'll want me to just sign my name or at least to draw some pictures or a picture
Right.
in the facing page,
Cool.
you see.
Yeah.
So I do that.
And so did you always get the original art back from Playboy?
Not originally, but I think after I just started, they started sending it back.
Oh,
Yeah,
just recently.
yeah.
Okay.
No. Shortly after I started working for Playboy.
Oh, okay.
It had been going for 10 years.
Mhm.
And so, no, I get it all back.
Mhm. So that's always been the case because
Yeah.
it's a thing in comic books. In the beginning, the artists wouldn't get their pages back. They would actually, when kids would come and tour the facilities, they would cut up the original art pages and hand out panels to the kids. And it was a big push for the creators and the artists to be able to get their pages back. So it's interesting that from the beginning, for the most part, Playboy was returning your original art to you.
Yeah. Well, the magazines I worked for always returned the original art,
Mhm.
you know. I should mention, too, that when we went to our first show, which was in San Jose, I was told I had to have something to sell. And I should create a book. So we have loads and loads, thousands, I guess, of rejects from Playboy.
Mm-hmm.
And so I decided to put together for a book my favorite rejects. And so we have 100 of them in this book, and we didn't know what to call it. And I went to see this designer, and he said, "Well, why don't you call it Unpublished Sneyd?" So we sold a lot of those,
Mm-hmm.
and the gags in them are really good. There's one mermaid gag that's been turned into a statue by
Wow.
a guy named Clay. Imagine a guy who's a sculptor, his name is Clay. And so he did a nice job on that.
What is the gag?
It's a gag of a mermaid. Isn't this awful? But there was one other gag that he might do.
Is there a favorite gag?
And she's saying, she's disheveled, a blonde, and she's in bed. And she says, "Hungry? I also cook in the kitchen." Yeah. And these, we get to sell a few of these things.
Mm-hmm.
But this coming to these shows has changed things immensely for us.
How so?
Well, you've got to travel.
Mm-hmm.
You're dealing with hotels
Right, sure.
and airfare and scheduling and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And then dealing with the companies that put these things on.
Right.
And so it's kind of disruptive.
What's it like meeting fans?
Pardon?
When you meet the fans at the shows?
Oh, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
They call me the legend, which doesn't
Yeah.
make me feel any younger. Yeah.
But it seems like that would be interesting after so many years working in seclusion to be coming out and meeting fans who have followed your work for a long time.
Yes, yes. And a lot of them say, I've been, you brought me up on this stuff, and such, and so on.
What do you think is the main difference from when you started to today in the type of work that you do and people who might want to pursue that kind of career?
Somebody came to me yesterday and they said, "I want to be a cartoonist." And how do we go about it?
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it's a lot more difficult to get into Playboy now,
Mm-hmm.
or the New Yorker. They both have their little band of contributors.
Right.
And I understand getting into the New Yorker is really a challenge.
Sure.
One of my favorite cartoons is a guy named Booth. He did the ones with the little dogs and the cats and so on. Apparently he had an awful time getting into the magazine.
Yeah.
At least
Well,
that's what I've heard.
And so when did you start working with the New Yorker?
Excuse me?
Like when you were working with the New Yorker and different, I'm just trying to get a sense of when you were starting in different magazines. It was in the early 60s that you started with Playboy.
It was 63.
Mm-hmm.
My first was published in 64.
Okay.
Yeah.
So over the years, being well known for the work you're doing in an adult magazine, did that affect you with your career in newspapers and other types of magazines?
No, it helped.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Martin Goodman, the managing editor of the Star, called me as a consequence.
Mm-hmm.
The competing paper had a guy named Ben Wicks doing the same thing. Only Ben's cartoon was just a column wide, whereas mine was given two columns. It was called Doug Sneyd.
Mm-hmm.
But that was a real grind, coming up with gag ideas all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And Anyway, I got to know a lot of people in the business, which is very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Most of these guys are quite sharing with their technique and anything new they've developed and so on. But most of them are, I don't know. I was going to say that they're only, when I go to the San Diego show,
Mm-hmm.
one year I checked it out and I found that there was only 2 women in one booth who still used a brush.
Oh, sure.
It's a dying art.
Mm-hmm.
Most of my friends are using computers. When we were in New York, I decided I met a guy who sold these things, a Cintiq.
Mm-hmm.
So I got one. I think it cost $2,300. I haven't used it. My lady puts Post-its on it. My kids said it must be the most expensive Post-it support ever.
Did you try it, or you just couldn't even get started with it?
I tried it a bit, but I found it right away that the colors couldn't match the colors I get with my dyes,
Mm-hmm.
that translucent look. And it seemed like a roundabout way to achieve what I wanted.
Mm-hmm.
So there it sits.
Yeah. And it's interesting because you speak about, learning to get the right inks and the right paper,
Mm-hmm.
and now everyone's using basically the same digital tablets.
Yeah. But I've got a lot of friends who use it for cartooning, and it seems to work for them. But it just wasn't my bag.
Mm-hmm. So you still do it the exact same way that you've done?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I have an opaque projector in both places.
Mm-hmm.
So I will do a small sketch, maybe this big, blow it up, redraw it, maybe put transparent paper over it,
Mm-hmm.
and redraw it some more. I do a lot of that. And then when I get it the way I want it, I will put it in my opaque projector, project it down on the board, and then start all the while sweetening it
Mm-hmm.
and improving it. And then by the time I go to color, I've also taken and made a copy of it, because I have a photocopier in both places.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll color in a rough on the photocopied piece. So that's my color rough, you see.
Mm-hmm.
And believe it or not, people pay for those things, even
Sure.
though and we tell them it's color on a photocopy.
Mm-hmm.
They still like them, yeah.
Well, you're hand coloring it though.
Hey?
The colors you've done by hand. On
Yeah,
top of the
oh
coating.
yeah,
Right.
oh yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
So how long is that whole process?
Everybody asks me this, how long does it take you to do a Playboy cartoon? And it varies, because some of them are quite detailed,
Mm-hmm.
and others are easy. In other words, half the time. It probably takes a couple of weeks. But I generally work on a number of things. I found that in the creative process, the more you can vary things, the better.
Hmm.
Like I always work on 2 cartoons at once,
Interesting.
and I have them sitting there. And art, especially what I do anyway, I find, is that you can be working on something, you hit a roadblock.
Mm-hmm.
The writers call it writer's block, I guess, or something. And because you're constantly making decisions. Does the line go here, or does it go there?
Mm-hmm.
What color are you going to do this blanket, And what's the value? And can I make that color that I want,
Mm-hmm.
you see? And so I have a blank board there that I'm constantly putting color on. The curse of dealing with aniline dyes is that if you want a flesh color, you better wait until the sample dries. Because if you don't, you'll find it changes. The color you put down there is quite different in value and sometimes in color than it was before it dried. Yeah.
So there's a lot of patience in knowing the.
Yeah. So if I run into a roadblock, a problem, and I can't solve it, I go to the other board and I start working away on that. And I was a great fan of Norman Rockwell. And I studied the way he worked. And one of the things he said, and it never left me, is that you should bring the whole painting up at once. Never concentrate on one thing, just keep bringing it up. It should always have a finished look about it. And so that's what I did. So if I go to the other board and I work on that, come back to the first one and I can't remember what the problem was. And I think you'd find this, you're to talk to anybody in the creative business, that your mind works best if you don't let it get stale on something. Yeah.
So if you could go back to yourself when you were first starting off, is there one piece of advice you'd give yourself?
Don't give in, don't quit. Be prepared for setbacks. They're inevitable. And mistakes aren't bad. You learn from them. But I think anybody who's successful will tell you the same thing.
But it's important.
I think a lot of people, and another thing is that I think a lot of people underestimate their potential. My mother was always telling me how brilliant I was. She had me convinced that I had more talent than Rembrandt, Michelangelo, and the whole bunch put together. And after a while, you get to believe it. And when I got out in this business, I found there are all kinds of guys who could draw better than I can, you know. And I come to a show like this, and they're brilliant artists here, absolutely brilliant. I'm not sure how much many of the public know who the gems are, you know. But no, I think a lot of people underestimate their potential. They need mothers who would. I was walking one day in Yorkdale, a shopping plaza, and this very wealthy-looking black woman was walking along with her little boy. And she was constantly telling him, "You're stupid, you're dumb," you know. And the kid's going to believe that. And it's unfortunate. They should teach the art of parenting, I think, somewhere, you know.
So do you credit your mom a lot with giving you the tenacity?
Yeah. I also worked, they gave me lessons, and a guy named Evan MacDonald, who was a portrait painter, he painted, I took lessons from him, and he painted George Drew, the Premier of Ontario. He was brilliant. And I learned a lot from him. Simple things like work from big to small, large to small, you know.
You mean physically? Explain that a little bit.
Work the big picture.
Right.
From big, and then you do the detail.
Right.
Something as simple as that,
Yeah.
you never forget it, you know.
What are some other things that you picked up along the way that have really helped you?
I don't know. I worked awfully hard when I was raised. We have 4 children. And my mother used to say when she'd phone me, "Doug, you're always working." I'd pick up the phone right away, you see. And I suppose some people think that life is a bowl of cherries, young people, and it's going to be handed to them, you know. And you got to work to learn hard. I mean, you have to work hard. Learn to work hard.
To were there major setbacks was there something in particular that was a major setback that you really had to push through?
No, I've been very fortunate.
Mm-hmm.
Had when my wife passed away, that was a setback.
Sure.
That was about 12 years ago. And that's something you never get over.
Right.
But my kids have all been very successful, married well, good family.
Mm-hmm.
So I've never had that worry, which is a blessing.
Yeah. Cool. Do we have any questions for Doug? Over here, in the black hat.
I was wondering if you ever done any kind of like art instruction or tutoring or anything like that?
One of the things I've lost is my hearing.
He was
Can you
asking
make it
if
a
you
little louder?
do any instruction or tutoring.
What's this?
Art instruction, if you've ever done any art instruction.
Yes. We have a college in Aurelia called Georgian College, and one year they asked me if I would teach a life class. I thought, well, this is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
They were going to send models up from the Ontario College of Art, 80 miles away in Toronto, just for this class. And so I thought, well, I'll do that. I'll give it a try. It worked out very well, excepting the drawback was that nobody in the class could draw. And that can be very disconcerting. And these gals would pose in the nude. So we got all kinds of people in that class. But that's about the only time I got into that. I did it just for 1 year. But that was the discouraging thing, was that nobody had any talent whatsoever.
Oh, jeez. And do you use models generally? Have you used models, or is it?
No. Although Heidi, my lady, said to me one day last year, she said, I can't be out of the country anymore. I need to get out of the country for 2 weeks. Can we go someplace? Let's go to Paris. And I said, why go to Paris? Why don't we go to London? There's far more happening in London. We've been to Paris, we've been to London. But she'd only been there a short time. So I said, if you can do something in terms of a write-off, that'd be nice. So she got in touch with this guy who comes to the San Diego show, who has a comics store right in downtown London, Piccadilly Circus,
Mm-hmm.
and had been wanting us to come over. So she got in touch with him in this godsend called the internet, and he said, here's what we'll do. He said, I was thinking of a little write-off, you see. And so what he did was that he arranged for 25 illustrators, that's all he could accommodate, to come and sit at this long table, 12 on each side, and I would have an easel up front, and there'd be a model sitting on a platform, and I thought, well, this is interesting. Then a week later, the same Friday night, there would be a chap interviewing me like this, you see.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what it was for. So that worked out very well. The model was just absolutely gorgeous, and she had 3 outfits. And I gave her a drawing when I was done, and afterwards I went around. And all these guys who were there, unlike my class in Aurelia, all of these guys were professionals.
Mm-hmm.
People who are illustrators or layout men or graphics or animators, and they'd all seen my book.
Mm, wow.
And so they knew what they were getting into. So,
Right.
so that was fun.
That's cool.
Yeah.
All right, great. Doug Sneyd, thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Go to the Dark Horse booth, pick up The Art of Doug Sneyd. They'll sign it for you down on the show floor.
Yeah,
Thanks.
very good.
I think I missed the cue. We only have 5 minutes left.
What?
Thank you so much. Was that okay?
Yeah.